Well, good morning. Thank you for being here and for participating in this important moment in Alaska's history. It's indeed a good week for our state when it comes to strengthening our families and growing our economy. And the news does keep getting better for our state. Today I'm announcing that my two benchmarks for gas line progress have been met. Resolution of the Point Thomson litigation in Alaska's interests, and historic alignment among major parties around a gas line to Tidewater within the state of Alaska. Last fall, I told the producers and TC Alaska that I wanted them to move into alignment on an Alaska gas line project to Tidewater in our state. I invited the CEOs of the three major producers in our state to discuss this and convened a meeting here in January. In my State of the State address, I delivered Alaska's expectations, our benchmarks for work that must be done this year to develop Alaska's abundant natural gas. I set the bar for the three major North Slope producers that by the end of the first quarter, they would need to resolve the Point Thomson litigation and second, consolidate their gas commercialization efforts. Point Thomson is the largest undeveloped oil and gas field in Alaska, holding 25% of the North Slope's known gas. Many administrations have struggled over the lack of production from this field, where the initial leases were granted 40 years ago. When the state decided to take those leases back, it triggered a significant but important legal battle with the producers that has already spanned three different administrations. In a few minutes, Natural Resources Commissioner Dan Sullivan will provide an overview of the agreement to resolve Point Thomson litigation, and the settlement advances the state's interests by assuring significant new investment will take place at the field, provides hydrocarbons into taps, and sets a timetable for full field development. Alaskans' resources will be produced from Point Thomson rather than remaining locked underground. The settlement includes firm work commitments and will help incentivize commercialization of North Slope gas, in addition to putting more oil into taps. The company's work also will provide new economic opportunities and jobs for Alaskans, short-term and long-term. Today, I also received a letter from ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and BP from their chief executives indicating a historic alignment on gas for Alaska, for Alaskans, and the markets beyond. This letter states that they are now formally aligned with the APP parties and have begun to undertake work together on the commercialization of North Slope gas with a specific focus on a large-scale LNG project from South Central Alaska, so through the state from South Central Alaska. Do not miss the historic significance of three CEOs signing together a document so relevant to resource development in our state. There's nobody in this building or in this city that we know of who has seen anything like this before in our state's history. These parties are working to finalize their gas commercialization project concept selection, which will focus on LNG exports from South Central Alaska. This work will include an associated timeline and an assessment of major project components, including in-state pipeline routes and capacities, global LNG trends, and LNG Tidewater site locations, among other components. My understanding is that the companies intend to complete their concept selection work this fall. The Point Thomson settlement clearly played a significant role in the company's overall alignment on North Slope gas that the CEOs announced today. Ending litigation and reaching alignment are important first steps, but the state of Alaska and the company still have much work to do. The state will be monitoring the company's gas commercialization efforts and their execution of work described in the settlement. The companies need to harden the numbers on an LNG project and identify a work schedule. They've got some more benchmarks from my State of the State address to meet this summer, next and third quarter. And having worked, I'll just take a step back for a second. Having worked for the Department of Natural Resources some years ago, I know how many hours of time people give to this effort, and it truly is a team effort. This team has been led by then AG and now our Commissioner Dan Sullivan. If I couldn't name everybody involved, but I can tell you that within our state agencies, tens of people have spent thousands of hours on working through this. Outside counsel like Ashburn and Mason Local Council here has been instrumental in helping put this together. In the Department of Law, Richard Todd has been extraordinary. Jonathan Katchen, DNR. I mean, there have been so many people who have participated in this and worked for Alaskans that I did want to call them out and say thank you to them from me. I'll now turn it over to Commissioner Sullivan to describe the key elements of the Point Thomson settlement, and after that we'll have time for questions and answers. Commissioner? Thank you,
Governor. Thank you, Governor. Good morning. So what I want to do is just, if you have the settlement before you, it's a very complex document, 60 pages. One thing that we try to do, if you take a look at the recitals, that's kind of a pretty good overview summary, and then a lot of it, as I mentioned, touches on a number of different things. But our primary goal for the settlement was and is to end what we viewed as the warehousing at the Point Thomson field of Alaska's resources and get commitment for near-term production going. We also had three other important goals for the settlement. First, a settlement must incentivize and lay out a clear path for full field development of Point Thomson. Second, a settlement must incentivize progress towards a major North Slope gas project. And third, a settlement must contain firm timetables and significant consequences if companies fail to meet their near-term obligations and commitments or decide not to pursue much broader full field development at Point Thomson. And the settlement meets these important strategic interests for the state. A simple and powerful principle runs throughout this agreement. The more work, the more commitment, more investment, and more production that occur, the more Point Thomson acreage the companies will retain. The common thread in the settlement is to begin production, keep momentum on developing this world-class field, or lose acreage. The companies are on the clock. This is a first. The settlement has many dates and timelines that have to be met. The companies earn their Point Thomson acreage. Without production, the leases at Point Thomson will terminate. So let me give a quick overview. There's essentially two major parts to this settlement. The first is what we call the initial production system, the IPS, and that's the near-term production that the companies have committed to. So in the short term, the settlement provides increased production as part of the IPS into TAPS at about an objective of 10,000 barrels a day from 2 wells, and that will occur no later than the winter of 2015-2016. A side note there, that was originally agreed to when we had the objective of 2014-2015 for that. Unfortunately, our friends in the federal government missed the EIS timeline, and so the state has now, because of the federal foot dragging, lost a whole year in terms of IPS production. Another key part of that IPS is that it will build a 70,000 barrel a day common carrier pipeline from the IPS into TAPS. Failure to do this work or indications that this work has been abandoned will result in automatic return of significant acreage to the state as early as 2015. A third delineation well will be drilled by the winter of 2016-2017. So in terms of the IPS, we see it has many strategic benefits for the state of Alaska.
We use acronyms a whole lot. So
Sorry.
Initial production.
Initial production system. Sorry, go. Yeah, I'm really bad on acronyms. Maybe it's my military background. It installs infrastructure necessary for full field development at Point Thomson. It will also provide critical information for the next phase of developing the Point Thomson field, and the infrastructure, particularly the 70,000 barrel a day common carrier pipeline, will create economies of scale and, for the first time in the state's history, open up the eastern North Slope to development, which is very, very important for other companies looking to produce from that part of the state. It will also provide significant near-term economic benefits. The companies, in meeting these commitments, will be investing additional hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of new infrastructure at Point Thomson in the next few years, And it's important to note that they've already spent, in doing some of this work, close to $1 billion, and has provided local hire, including to rural residents, and employment to roughly 170 firms operating in Alaska. The agreement's Alaska hire commitment will help ensure that Alaskans continue to benefit from this economic activity. But one of the key things in the agreement, and one of the key things that has been part of the struggle with regard to Point Thomson litigation, has been what happens after the initial production system is online and producing. So that's a very important aspect of the settlement that we have focused on, where it has pathways, incentives, and benchmarks for this post-initial production system phase. So what we call full field development of Point Thomson. So the most important of these alternatives of full field development of Point Thomson is a major gas sale pipeline project commercializing North Slope gas. If you look at the settlement, this is a primary goal of the agreement, and we believe the agreement will advance a major gas sale project in a number of ways. In fact, in some ways it already has started that. First, it unlocks the potential and resources of the Point Thomson field, which, as the governor mentioned, contains approximately 25% of the North Slope's gas. The agreement requires that in addition to the initial production work that is starting now and has been ongoing, that the parties undertake work to commercialize North Slope gas now, in conjunction with working on the IPS. And so the CEO letter that the governor announced this morning is the formal alignment that makes public this work that in many ways has been going on among the companies in TransCanada for weeks. This alignment is very important with regard to a major gas sale, and as the governor mentioned, it's unprecedented in the state of Alaska. The Point Thomson settlement clearly drove this alignment among the producers. More specifically, the agreement also incentivizes progress on a major gas project off the North Slope. So, for example, one of the provisions in it, it provides 2 windows for the producers to sanction a major gas sale project off the North Slope. The first window is from now until 2016. If they do that, if they make a sanction decision between now and 2016, they will secure additional Point Thomson acreage. The second window is from 2016 to 2019. But if they wait that long to sanction a major gas sale or major pipeline off the North Slope, they will also be required to do additional engineering and permitting work on the other full field development alternatives that are laid out in the settlement. These 2 other alternatives are, one is to significantly increase the amount of liquids from Point Thomson into TAPS, and the second alternative is a complex reservoir integration project between Point Thomson and Prudhoe Bay that will result in increased liquids from Point Thomson, enhanced Prudhoe Bay recovery into TAPS, and gas for in-state use in Alaska no later than 2019. We are focused on a major gas line project as a key part of this settlement, and so are the producers. But because of uncertainties that remain and on the inability to predict the future, we strongly believe that the state's interests are best protected by having full field development alternatives in addition to the major gas sale project. All of these alternatives, if pursued, and they can be pursued simultaneously, will result in significant, we're talking multi-billion-dollar investments in the state and significant jobs for Alaska. So the bottom line on the 2, the IPS and the alternatives together, is that this agreement does not guarantee a major gas line for Alaska, but it certainly moves us a significant step closer. The IPS required by the agreement and the full field development alternatives set forth in the agreement all serve as a pre-investment on the ultimate goal of large-scale commercialization of gas from the North Slope in terms of the billions of dollars of infrastructure, wells, pads, pipelines required for such a large-scale project. So I just want to conclude by stepping back and just mentioning kind of the broader picture. Again, if you look at a map of the North Slope, the eastern North Slope, one of the most highly prospective areas in Alaska and probably in the country, is not producing any hydrocarbons. We are coming, both in terms of Alaska, but also in terms of the country, in terms of a new era. There's predictions that the United States is becoming a hydrocarbon superpower again, and there's new opportunities in Asia. This critical field, American critical field, Alaska's critical field, Point Thomson, has been dormant and or in litigation for over 4 decades. It's time to get this great resource into production and moving forward with its full potential, and that's exactly what this agreement does. I just, as the governor mentioned, also want to just thank a number of folks, because this has been a very long undertaking by so many. Joe Bailash, Kurt Gibson, Tom Irwin, Marty Rutherford, Mark Myers. I feel like I'm at the Oscars here, but a lot of hard work. John Ketchen, of course, and we think that this is an important settlement for the state. Thank you.
I would like to point out that given the agreement that you all have just received and that is just going up on the web, and given that the commissioner will be briefing legislators tomorrow on a more detailed basis related to the agreement, and that briefing, as I understand it, will be open as well to the media. You'll have time to digest it and ask more detailed questions about the agreement at that point too, and of course in the days ahead. But with that, we'd open it up to any questions you might have. Yeah.
There's no gas line within the agreement, so as good as this sounds, many Alaskans want that gas line. Talk about the reality of that.
I think you've heard it here. And unless you have Point Thomson gas combined with Prudhoe Bay gas, the long-term gas interests of Alaska cannot be maximized. What you're seeing here is resolution of litigation that has occurred across 3 administrations. We don't have any production there whatsoever, but now we have firm work commitments towards that. And when you combine that with the alignment of these companies together with the APP parties, the TransCanada Exxon alignment that was already there, what that does is it brings together disparate interests on one side of the equation and consolidates them into that effort. And then you've got the other effort with the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation, for example, and HB9, which is attempting to consolidate ANGDA with HB9 and the AGDC. If we can get the state off of, going 6 different directions and consolidate into 2 that can then merge into a gas line, we will have a gas line sooner in Alaska's interest than if we spend our time trying to spray a shotgun shell, as opposed to this more targeted approach. So bottom line is, this is moving Alaska's gas interest forward for us as Alaskans, and maximizing that interest for years ahead. Okay, so if you remember and I'll have the commissioner address beyond what I say, but if you will, your HB 110 addresses oil taxes. One of my benchmarks that I set forth in the State of the State was that if these benchmarks for progress are met, if these companies resolve Point Thomson, get alignment on a gas line, meet together with AGDC, and meet those benchmarks in the State of the State for this year, which the next set of benchmarks are due in the fall. I also then said, as an administration, we would be ready to work with legislators on gas taxes next year in 2013 to move forward on a gas line. Do you have any more?
No, Bill, can you be more specific? I guess I'm.
Well,
There's no
linkage there.
No, I mean the sure.
Well, I can just tell you from an economic perspective and from the company's perspective, they'll factor in the costs of each, but I can tell you that this settlement stands on its own and is not tied to HB 110 changes. But I think what it does is it says we're getting our house in order to maximize this gas for Alaska's interest, just as on the tax side, we're getting our house in order to incentivize more investment on the oil side. So they are linked from an economic perspective for Alaska's future, but in terms of the settlement being tied to a specific bill or anything, no.
Your final package to the 10,000 barrels a day gas line, so I guess it's less than 20 gas and so that reason, Thomson somewhere?
Correct. So that,
That's one alternative.
well, that's the original commitment. So that's not an alternative. That's a commitment. And they don't do that.
For 10,000.
That's the original commitment at 10,000 barrels a day, and that's near term. And if they don't do that, we could start getting acreage back at Point Thomson as early as 2015.
How much acreage will we get back? How valuable is that acreage? And also, how much value will it take out of that 10,000 barrel a day process?
Well, the 10,000 barrel a day process has a number of important aspects to it. The initial production system. First is that it's just the liquids, right? But second, and I think many of you know, it's a very complex, high pressure reservoir, and actually doing that kind of condensate cycling, I don't know if it's been done anywhere in the world in a reservoir with such high pressure. So what the companies are going to learn from doing that is actually quite important in terms of what the next alternative use, the broader, what we've been calling the full field development use of Point Thomson is. Third is there's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of spending that is going into that IPS. And whatever the next alternative, whether it's major gas sales, whether it's the expanded liquids production, or whether it's the integration of Point Thomson and Prudhoe Bay for a number of ways in which will enhance hydrocarbon recovery, the IPS is a pre-investment to all of those alternatives. So it's important in a lot of ways. And then, as I mentioned, the 70,000 barrel a day pipe, that's a common carrier pipe. So you're another company now and you want to explore in the eastern North Slope, you find some oil, that pipe, in terms of transporting that oil into taps, is going to be open to you.
How long will that last?
Well, the IPS, and again, we can go, the IPS has to be online until it runs out, or one of the commitments, if there's for example, if there's a major gas sale off the North Slope and the hydrocarbons are running through a pipe, then the commitment with regard to the IPS can, at that point, go away because you're using the field for a whole nother hydrocarbon production scenario. So, like say, for example, if the full field development scenarios, there are three. These are alternatives, right? If the companies don't either sanction a major gas sale or commit to one of these, then they will have automatic contraction of significant acreage from Point Thomson. They'll be able to continue, if they're continuing to produce the 10,000 barrels a day, certain leases where they're producing from, and state law that's required by us. But if they don't move beyond it, significant contraction, and importantly, one of the things that we thought was very important, for some reason they don't follow through on the IPS or do any of the alternatives, even though there's producing wells on certain leases, which usually hold leases, we have a provision in there that says we get it all back, all of it, by 2019, including the leases with the producing wells on it. Sure. Absolutely. Sure. Well, we'd be glad, and tomorrow we're going to get into a lot more of that as well.
I just wondered if this model is typical, where you got this idea of having these different alternative ways to approach it, depending on what they do.
This is, I'm a recovering commercial attorney, and I can tell you that having benchmarks of progress and having gates to step through, that is a normal part of commercial negotiations. But it's all in whether, in the end, you can look at the agreement as a whole and say it's in Alaska's interest. And given the production commitments, given the consequences if they're not followed through, given the opportunities for Alaskans with gas and jobs, this is clearly in our interest. But again, these benchmarks are a common part of commercial negotiations.
You just mentioned one other thing. So, I just adding on to what the governor said, I think that this field is so significant, the litigation has been going on so long, that at least from our perspective, there's certain provisions in here that we would consider very unique, that we would not undertake, both that were helpful to the state, but also there are incentives in here in terms of if the companies take certain actions, they're going to be able to retain certain acreage, right? And so I would say that there are aspects of this, given the unique history and the importance of this field, that we don't consider are going to be precedents for other kind of agreements like this.
Yes, you go ahead.
So, sure, sorry. So the initial production system, they've already been working on that. So what happened when the unit was defaulted, one of the things that Commissioner Irwin did is that he did allow the parties to go and start drilling on a few key leases. So that work has been ongoing. One of the things again that we did in terms of really trying to kind of belt and suspender that work is that there's a provisional work schedule as an attachment with regard to the IPS in the agreement. And we essentially say, hey, we know that this is not exact, but you need to commit, you need to keep this provisional work schedule, and a lot of it is construction, most of it's construction here in Alaska. And if you don't, and for example, if you kind of take a year off, that will be considered an indication that you've abandoned the IPS, and we get automatic acreage return.
Let's go online.
Thank you. The lines are open. If you'd like to ask a question, please press star one. Becky, go ahead.
Governor, it's Becky Borley. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Go ahead, Becky.
Can you be more specific about what you'd like to see or what you need to see by September when you talk about the two projects companies, especially within having some sort of work plan and kind of if I get a better sense for what we should expect by September. And then I also wanted to ask, you talk about the formal alignment under the GS, but DC in particular has been very clear that it does not like the terms of the GS. So I wonder how formal it is if at least one party doesn't like it and how we move forward.
Well, Becky, I don't have my state of the state in front of me, but you can take direct quotes from there on the third quarter benchmarks, and I don't want to get afoul of those at the moment. So use that as the guide. But to your the second half of your question again.
You said that you wanted to have a formal alignment under GIA, but at least UP has been very clear on the record that it does not, it does not like the terms of the GIA and would like to have some of those changed. And I wonder what alignment under the GIA framework means specifically to you, and how you move forward with at least one party saying it doesn't agree to the terms of the GIA.
Well, first off, I use the terms under an AGIA framework in the state of the state for a purpose. The Alaska Gasline Inducement Act has some key benefits for Alaskans that are in that agreement. For instance, required offtakes for communities, a tariff structure that benefits Alaska consumers so that they don't have to pay transportation costs somewhere else beyond their community and back. It guarantees access, by the nature of the rate structures in AGIA, it guarantees access to that pipeline by future explorers. So those benefits of AGEA are something that I think are very important to Alaskans. On the other hand, I have told these companies that they were to get alignment and focus on an Alaska line LNG project to Pacific Rim type countries, because that appears to be where the market is right now. That's where they're paying 14 bucks an M for gas instead of $2 an M in the lower 48. That's what we see now, is this alignment around that. Now, if that requires, I think AGEA contemplated this, clearly contemplated a route through Alaska to Tidewater. But in this next phase of this alignment, it might be necessary to make changes to accommodate this. For instance, a project plan amendment for TransCanada with respect to the FERC, to make sure that they can do that timely and get that done, may require some kind of amendments to the Alaska Gas Line Inducement Act. We're not there yet, but I can tell you that under an AGEA framework means it's got to be in Alaska's interests, and it's got to retain the notion that any gas line that gets built is going to benefit our communities, and through different ways that you see are present in the Alaska Gas Line Inducement Act.
Rich, go ahead.
Thanks. Governor Commissioner, under AGEA, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought that TransCanada had to file first by October of this year. Is that still the case, or is that it's still?
So, Rich, what we're
Dan Salt.
yeah, sorry. What we're doing, we're in discussions with TransCanada right now, because really what you see, as the governor mentioned, on the idea of a project plan amendment, and because right now what you're seeing, and if you see the CEO letter, and I don't know if there are copies with regard to the CEO letter on the table, but we're in a bit of a transition period between looking at a focus on LNG, which is clearly what the parties are aligning around, and the work to Alberta. And so what we're going to be doing, we've had some preliminary discussions with TransCanada, but we're going to be looking at a likely project plan amendment that addresses the very question that you asked, which is in terms of, at this transition phase with regard to in between Alberta and a much more robust focus where everybody's aligned with new partners in terms of the producers on LNG, what makes the most sense in terms of a spend, in terms of suspending possibly that requirement right now and focusing on the LNG work, and those discussions are going to continue with TransCanada.
Tim, go ahead.
My question really, I think, has been answered. It was just how LNG fit into this, but I think that's been answered. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Amanda, go ahead.
That's me.
Amanda, go ahead, please.
Oh yeah, hi, thanks. Thanks for taking the question. I'm wondering in this letter with the big line alignment, is there any timetables for that? Number one. And number two, is it how somebody said it was very historic and nothing like this has been seen. And Frederick has some better deals with producers to build a pipeline. And I'm just wondering what if this different or more historic or not.
Certainly at the time, that was a significant milestone. There's no question. The difference here is these are three CEOs of these companies signing. You didn't see that before, and this is something that you don't see, at least not in our state that I'm aware of. And frankly, I'm thankful that we are in a place now where Alaska is clearly at the top of these companies' lists, and their signature demonstrates that.
Joe, go ahead, please.
Hi, isn't the Asian market way being oversaturated? It's got $100 billion project to be built still in Australia, and it's concerned that there won't be when it comes to take that off. Is this really a sufficient time to be
my goal is to get Alaska's gas to Alaskans and to markets beyond. I think that's a question that should be more properly addressed to these companies that are spending real dollars on pursuing that. So now that we have this historic alignment among three companies, along with the APP parties, so TC Alaska and Exxon there, that ought to be a strong indicator that the Asian market certainly can bear Alaska's gas. So go ahead.
So just one other point on that, which is there's additional gas that other areas of the world are looking to supply what is clearly a growing Asian demand. But what in our discussions and kind of what we have seen with regard to interest from potential customers is not just additional gas, but sources of supply that diversify sources of supply. And if you're getting a lot of gas from Russia or Qatar right now, and you're in an Asian country, you probably don't want to double down on those countries. And so what we've been seeing is a lot of interest in not only more gas, but specifically Alaska gas, because it provides many, many comparative advantages that other places that supply gas to Asia don't have.
Aaron, go ahead. Aaron Gallo, do you have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, the document I looked at seems to suggest that the core cap in terms of what we're doing is we need to test the give the further insight. Is that what's the company and the core cap that the company has to approve things?
No, it doesn't have to, and it's mostly perfunctory. It's already happened.
Tom, go ahead.
So exporting American energy is one that strikes a lot of folks, certainly the lower 48 surprising. I'm sure you're aware of NYP's like that as well. How would you explain that to the rest of the country though? How does this benefit them and the idea of this new employee to an LNG export project and benefit them, not just Alaska?
First off, Congressman Markey I believe, is pursuing that for a number of reasons. But in the case of Alaska, we have been exporting gas to Japan for 40 years. So this is nothing new in that regard. Secondly, this gas is not going into the American markets at this point. There's no harm caused to Americans, but frankly, there is benefit caused to Americans, namely Alaskans and companies that have interests not only here but across the lower 48 that employ Americans. So I would suggest that Congressman Markey be focused on growing our economy rather than trying to shut down options for Americans.
Becky, go ahead.
I wanted to follow up on something that Commissioner mentioned about the development of project plan, project plan, whether we could maybe kind of legislative discussion to be able to accomplish that, or that's something that can be done in
Becky, I believe that under AGIA, the project plan amendment, depending on the form it takes, AGIA contemplates that the Commissioner of Natural Resources and the Department of Revenue have the authority to make that. There's actually already been at least one project plan amendment that had been previously approved by those two commissioners with regard to the project.
Rich, go ahead.
Thanks. One quick follow-up to that, and that is, as Jen is made,
Yeah, Rich, can you just clarify that again?
I'm sorry. If there's a project plan amendment that one of the time plans was that let's talk about it. We're going to make a final first, and so we're still honoring on the date, and it's still to
So if, as the licensee, if the project plan amendment is approved, and again, during this transition phase, that they would still be entitled to reimbursement depending on where they were focusing their efforts. Something, though, that's actually important, and in our discussions with TransCanada, it's important to actually to relay this more publicly, is that they filed these significant resource reports as part of the APP process, and that work, very important work in terms of regulatory, environmental, no matter what pipeline comes through Alaska, we got to do that work. And the useful thing about a lot of that work that they filed in February is it has very significant, the aspect we're trying to look at, possibly 50 to 60% dual use applicability. So what does that mean? That means that work, that regulatory work, could be used in terms of an in-state LNG or a line to Alberta. So the idea that a lot of the work that they've done, a significant amount of the work, and it's been very substantial, can be utilized for a project that focuses now on an in-state LNG line.
Thank you, Gareth. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Gareth Larson. What happened to Chevron? Can you explain? I understand the dropout.
Say that, Gareth, one more time.
Chevron, can you say what happened to Chevron?
So one of the things about the Point Thomson settlement that it wasn't, a lot of the focus was the settlement between the state and the working interest owners, which is what the settlement we've announced today is. But there's also very, very significant part of the settlement was the settlement between the working interest owners among themselves on commercial terms. Exactly. None of which we've been privy to. So the question with regard to what happened to Chevron, I think, is best directed to Chevron.
Ed, go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much. My question's already been asked, actually.
Okay, thank you. Any wrap-up questions here in the room? HB 9 will not come to my desk in the same form it's in, as I mean, as I do, that it's got to go through the Senate. So for me to say exactly what I would do would be premature, but I have communicated with the Speaker that I continue to support passage of HB 9. I'll continue working to assure that the state will get gas to Alaskans as quickly as we can. And I'm not going to, at this point, cut off another option. But instead, we're consolidating now down to two options that I believe will eventually here merge and align and get this gas to Alaskans. So at this point, it would be premature for me to tell you what I would do with HB 9, except that I continue to support it moving through the session and through the legislature. Anything else?
Now, what can you tell fellow Alaskans who are sort of in a position where they push off, another timeline, back and forth in 25 years, 50 years, and that's looking at different options to move forward over the future.
Okay.
So one of the things that you're right, that not you're right on your point, but it's a very complex settlement in that one of the things that we actually tried to do was keep the parties focused on production. And so by that, one of the things that we thought from the state's perspective, and one of the reasons it took a long time to settle this, was to think through different contingencies to actually keep us out of court. So you might want to take a look at, and there are areas where we made compromises, right? This is a very, this is a long, 2.5 year almost settlement negotiation. But if you look at some of the things, like you'll see throughout the settlement, there's a phrase that's capitalized that says, without appeal. Read the definition of without appeal. It essentially says if something happens and it's determined and there's automatic release of acreage, you, the producers, that's it. You're done. You've got to waive all your rights. You cannot appeal this in any way, shape, or form. And so, but there's other provisions, there's arbitration provisions in there that we wanted in there actually in the state's interest to get quick decisions. So a lot of the complexity of the agreement is actually to keep us out of court, to make sure that the commitments are ironclad, and that's why there's a lot of complex elements in there about different processes that the state and the working interest owners will go through trying to anticipate contingencies in the future.
Obviously not for now, but it seems like there was some success, or there must have been some sort of jump start that the state had in order to get to this point. How would you say when?
This resolution of Point Thomson is clearly a win for Alaska. I mean, Alaskans do not win when their resources are tied up in litigation for years and years and years. And to have real work commitments, to have real production or real consequences means that Alaskans' interest is maximized. But of course, parties will only resolve litigation if they feel like they have won as well. So this could be deemed as a win-win for everybody and maximizing investment in our state. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.